So thank you very much for having me, and also for being patient. I'm not really sure what's happening with the camera and with the sound. And so that would be a first for me, talking, giving a presentation where I can't hear the audience. So if you want to tell me that I'm running out of time, or you have a question, please interrupt me through a chat. This is how I'll be able to communicate with you. So today's focus of the presentation is a big question. I've realised that I've posed a big question, which I then for myself, which I have to answer. So I'd like us to look today at what the language lens can do for business and management studies. So I'll start by a few words of introduction about myself and a background. Doris, could we have the next slide, please? Or shall I share it? Because I think I can share the video during the session. Okay. Yeah. I can also try to share the slide. Okay, so right. So looking at the looking very quickly at my background, so that you know a little bit where I'm coming from. So I have a background in applied linguistics. This was my first master's. I studied applied linguistics at Warsaw University, and I trained to be a professional interpreter, and I specialised in simultaneous interpretation, German and English. I then ventured into a different area, which was applied social sciences. I did an MSc also at Warsaw University. And this is where I discovered organizational anthropology, and this was a key turning point for me. I really fell in love with organization studies, which then led me to my third degree, which was a PhD in business at Oxford Brookes University. And I had the pleasure of working with Doris, who at that time was my supervisor. And after the PhD, I started working much closer at the intersection of different disciplines in particular. So I see now my home discipline to be organization studies, but I'm gradually returning to my first home discipline, which is the linguistics. And this is how I started to merge the issues of language with the issues of organization studies, and also international business. We are ready to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So to answer the big question for today, I've prepared way too many slides. You can see them, but there are a lot of them have references. Just in case you are interested in some of the issues that I've raised. But I thought that the best way to answer this question is through illustration. So my plan today is to look at, to start with, introducing you to the notion of language sensitive studies. Some of you might be well familiar with the concept, so apologies, but I thought it would be important to present an overview of what language sensitive studies are, and then to illustrate it with some examples. I've prepared 3, but I'm well aware of the fact that I'll probably only be able to focus on 2. I've got the third one as a backup, so I thought that I'll give an example about how language sensitive studies can advance international business studies. And to do this, I'll draw on the 2 papers that I've published focusing on translation as part of wider political processes within multinational. Then I would like us to move on to a different example, which focuses on how the language lens can advance diversity and inclusion studies, so looking at a different field. And through this example, I'll showcase how drawing on a variety of disciplines that have a focus on language can help advance organization studies. And then if we have time, should we have time, I'll focus on another example, which is not a published paper just yet, and it focuses on using the language lens to advance organization studies. And I would like to end with a few avenues for future research. So let's look at language sensitive studies. So the term has been coined in international business And it started with the pioneering work of Rebecca Pickering in the late 1990s. So at that time, there wasn't that much awareness about the importance of language. So language appeared naturally in studies on multinationals, but it was discussed as typically as a variable, sometimes hidden within culture, sometimes studied separately. But it was seen as, it was mentioned very briefly in the studies. And gradually, awareness started to increase that language actually plays a very significant role. And multinational organizations are in fact multilingual organizations. So really, in order to understand strategy and the inner workings of multinationals, we have to look at language very seriously. So that realization coincided with the change of focus. So early studies focused on language as linked with national languages. So that view of language sees it as very much a unified system, as something stable, as something that has fixed boundaries, as something that perhaps resides in grammar books and it is separate from its users. So that was the early thinking about language. But because of the cross-pollination of ideas and focus on and the borrowing of concepts and perspective from other disciplines, disciplines that have worked with language for much longer, then the understanding of language has become much more nuanced within the disciplines. And more recently, over the past probably 10 years or so, we're starting to see a more gradual shift from this static focus on language to a view of language as a social practice, as language as embedded in interactions and in context. So not as something that is fixed, not as something that resides in individuals, but language as being brought to existence through interactions. So we're looking at the mixed usage of language, different language norms that change depending on the context of interaction. We're looking at translanguaging, code switching, using hybrid languages. So here we are focusing very much on the interaction rather than as language as something stable, fixed, and out there. And through this gradual shift and focus on language, there's a growing recognition that language really affects a great variety of topics in international business. So it affects strategy, it affects the decision-making processes, so it has implications on the macro perspective, but also it is very important on the team level perspective. It affects team processes, decision-making, relationships, knowledge transfer within the team, relationships, communication, identity formation, etc. So there's a growing body of research in international business and international management, and in international and cross-cultural communication as well, which has started to take language much more seriously. So language not as a variable, not as an add-on or an afterthought, but as a really important and distinctive topic, and therefore we have now a distinctive substream of research. But interestingly, this upstream of international business doesn't really always talk that much with the organization studies discipline, although language has been discussed in organization studies at length, but more from a discursive perspective rather than language as a medium of communication and as the linguistic resources that people draw on. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about the different ways of approaching language, I would recommend the paper by Canhonen and colleagues, which was published in 2018. It's a very nice overview. So if we can carry on, thank you. I'd like us to look at the first example. In twin papers that I've published with with colleagues, we're focusing on trying to advance, to really pay attention to language and treat language seriously, and through this try to advance the studies of international business. And we did that through focusing on translation, interlingual translation. While translation is a concept used a lot in international business, paradoxically, it does not really focus on language. It focuses on, it draws on Scandinavian institutionalism, and it focuses on the transfer of practices from one institutional cultural context to another. For example, this can be diversity management practices or person improvement practices, or values, or corporate values, and how they move from one setting to another. But in this strand of work, which has a very long tradition now, the focus has been on sense-making, meaning-making, the cultural editing of practices in order to facilitate implementation. But paradoxically, despite the name, language has not really been part of serious consideration. In fact, Norbert Czarniawska, who's one of the founding fathers of Scandinavian institutionalism, suggested that translation moves beyond the mere language translation. And what we're trying to do in the papers is show that interlingual translation is not mere interlingual translation. It has very important purposes. If we can look at the next slide. Thank you. So these are the two papers. Today I'll focus more on the second paper. It is much more detailed than the first one. So in the first paper, we looked at interlingual translation and the transfer of value-infused practices, namely corporate values, which were created by the headquarters and then passed on to subsidiaries of multinational organization within this multinational organization. The second paper focuses on the micropolitical dynamics of the translation process. So I'll start by telling you a little bit more about the background of the study. And hopefully I can get the slides to support me in this. Thank you. So the background of the study was conducted in a Polish subsidiary of a leading American pharmaceutical multinational. It is one of the top American pharmaceutical companies. So the study was carried out in Poland. It is very important to understand the context of that particular study. So the organization in question had a history of changing its factory general managers, who stayed in the subsidiary for about 2 years and then left. Why does it matter? It matters because with them came every 2 years different sets of values, different sets of objectives, different sets of claims, which were supposed to motivate the workforce. At the time of data collection, the subsidiary was recovering from a history of a very turbulent history. There was a period of micromanagement, severe conflict between the last ex-factory general manager and the workforce. There were serious tensions, unprecedented level of both voluntary and involuntary staff turnover. And a new management team joined the organization. These were largely external appointments. So they have a new cadre of management. We have a traumatized workforce that has been paralyzed by increasing micromanagement, bureaucracy, workforce that thinks that they can't really do much, that have lost enthusiasm for work. That's a part of the initiative that I was studying was an initiative of a culture change or culture reinvigoration. The new management team wanted to improve the performance of the organization, improve the morale, and refocus the culture of the organization through a project, and part of which, an important part of which was a sub-project focused on the management of corporate values. But the problem was that the corporate values had been with the organization and the subsidiary for quite a few years, but they were in English, and they've never been translated. And some of the values actually are quite difficult to understand in Polish. So the values were achieving, care, pioneering, and endurance. So for example, the word endurance is not one of the easiest of all words. So quite a few staff did not really understand, they did not know the values. The project was initiated by by the corporate side of the business. So all subsidiaries were told that they needed to reinvigorate the corporate values. And how they did it was up to them. The idea was that it was part of the corporate branding and focusing on enhancing the perceptions of corporate social responsibility. If we can move forward a little bit, thank you. So looking at the methodology, it was an in-depth single case study. I carried out 65 interviews just to get a very rich understanding of context. If we want to study micropolitics and cultural changes, it is important to understand the context. So to that end, I carry out 2 ways of data collection. At the outset of the culture project, carried out 40 interviews and 25 towards the end of the project. So it was important to look at the longitudinal data to see how views changed over time. But quite unusually for this particular 2 papers, we zoomed in on naturally occurring talk, and we focused on a translation event. That was a 6-hour session that was supported by external consultants, and for which both senior local managers and also selected middle managers who acted as value champions were invited. And the task was to translate corporate values into Polish. But it was clear that the translation would not be a linguistic exercise. It was translation focused on recontextualization, making sure that the values fitted both the local agenda, the local cultural context, and the local politics. If we can move ahead. So looking at the first paper, in that paper, I'll mention it only very briefly. We zoomed in on the translation session and showed how looking at engaging in the translation helped local managers make sense of the corporate values, but also make sense of the local values. So it was a very important sense-making platform. And how the exercise enabled them to change the attitude from a very skeptical one towards working with values to one which was more open towards values, and looking at how it enabled them to make cultural adaptations. But for the purposes of this presentation, really to showcase how the language lens can help us advance international business and management studies, I want us to look at the second paper. If we can move on. Thank you. So starting point conceptually, it is not a secret that multinationals are very much a contested terrain that is underpinned by a wide area of political interest. So the politics is very complex when we talk about multinationals, and I'm sure colleagues present today some of you have studied multinationals, so you will be able to so you will recognize this problem. So this is well known in international business that multinationals are a contested political terrain. And some studies have pointed to the importance of micropolitical processes within the multinational, and how those micropolitical processes impact strategic decision making and are very consequential. But still, those micro processes remain under theorized, so under conceptualized, but also empirically under explored. What we know is that the papers tend to focus on actors and how actors exercise influence on others. So the focus is on actors exercising power in order to achieve certain outcomes. But we don't really know that much about the interactions, the micropolitical interactions. And we wanted to address this by also drawing on language, and look at how and explore the language-based underpinnings of micropolitical behavior in multinationals. To do this, we knew that I would have to really make use of translation studies, which has developed the conceptual repertoire in order to help us in this process. So we drew on power turn in translation studies, and we saw in this particular setting, we saw translation, interlingual translation, as a dynamic and situated and also political process. So rather than seeing translation, we tend to perhaps intuitively think of translation as a text. So translation as a text, or a single activity of transposition from one semiotic code to another. However, we expanded the definition of translation, and we saw it can be a longer process. It's a process of negotiation between different interests, the interests of the commissioner of the translation, interests of the actors, but also we need to consider the interest of the target recipients of the translation. And so the translation for us was a series of decision-making processes. And this view of translation was enabled, as I mentioned earlier, by us drawing on the power turn in translation studies. So in the paper, we're showing how the politics unfolded through interlinked processes that we observed in the translation. We can move ahead. Thank you. So what we observed in the study was, first of all, that very clear purposing or even repurposing of the translation event. It was cast, so the corporate project, as I mentioned before, was very much about branding, and the corporate values were much more abstract, which is not uncommon when we look at the literature on corporate values. They were more abstract, they were much more general. The local management team decided that they allocated a very big part of their training budget to the corporate culture project and also to the translation. So the consultants did not come cheap, and also they invested a lot of their time. They spent the whole day on the event because they recognized the importance. But they translated the purpose. They translated for themselves. They agreed the purpose of the project in the translation. And the intended outcome was to put a local stamp on the project. It was to align it and to align the translated text with their political agenda. And that discussion of the translation started well before the translation event. So we could see the negotiations, the discussions taking place before the translation, where actors, because they knew what was coming, engaged in discussions and explained and negotiated the meaning of the translation. What we kept hearing was that the values project was very important for their business, and that they had to ensure that the values would work. And they thought that the values could only work if they were translated in the right way. So the translation could not be outsourced to professional translation services. It was actually very much a political managerial process, or a leadership process, where the local team wanted to imbue corporate values with the local desirable meaning. And the intention was to trigger attitudinal and behavioral change among staff. Thank you. Transcreation, yes, I wonder if you look into this. So we can have a look at the questions later, but yes, that's very much, this is a concept used, transcreation. It has been used by Rebecca Beccari, for example, in her work with Kaiser Koskinen, and when they talk about translation as creating, as also creation, as creating a new text rather than just recreation of what exists in a different language. That's a very good comment. Thank you. So looking at the translation, what we've noticed that there were other important processes there, and we've differentiated them, and I will unpack them separately, but these were taking place interchangeably. I'll share a model which captures the processes later. So another important micropolitical process was a process which we refer to as reframing, which is a process which imbued the text with the preferred local meanings. And in the paper, there are a lot of different examples of how this was accomplished. And in the online version, we've also created a table with further examples. But what the purpose, what we've observed was that the different corporate values, which were much more abstract, focused on making improvement in people's lives, were translated and were discussed in the local setting through the lens of the local needs. And two values, not surprisingly, effectiveness and efficiency, appear to take on the most important and superordinate value. Just to show you an example here, when the discussion focused on the value of endurance, in the corporate definition, the focus was very much on the tradition and also respect for tradition, which was very problematic in the Polish setting because of the turbulent past. So one executive says, well, that could be translated as respect for tradition. Another says, to outlive everyone. There's some laughter. Another says, do you like lasting? There's a resounding no. An executive suggests, oh, for me, this is persistence in achieving goals. So persistence in achieving goals. So we have that very much performative element being seen as needed to be added. And another executive suggests, lasting has a passive element to it. They didn't really want to have something passive as a value. So another executive agrees, says lasting is quite passive, and there's longer discussion about the need for change, for improving things, in particular in light of the context and the turbulent history. So another executive says, well, we're looking for an expression which will encompass both lasting and this positive changes. And then the general manager's persistence, which in Polish, the Polish word was wytrwałość, which can also be translated into English as perseverance, which was very welcomed by another executive. This is what I mean, right? So again, the focus was very much on finding a value label, but also focusing on editing the explanation, which would signal to the staff what is important and align that with the current need. We're ready to look at the next process. Thank you. The next process that we've identified, we refer to as domesticate. And that process in our reading consisted of 3 sub-processes. So in the discussions, participants, when they agreed and argued with each other, when they negotiated the meaning, they were very much concerned about preempting resistance. So when they disagreed with one proposed definition, they would say, no, we cannot have this because it doesn't fit, because participants won't buy into this. Or they wanted to increase relatability, so they wanted to look both for a label which would appear more attractive and more relatable to staff, and therefore increase the chances of its acceptance of the values. But also there was a clear element of cultural censoring. So there were suggestions being made about elements which was not seen as fitting the local context. And just to illustrate with some examples, so Natalia suggests when discussing the value of pioneering and looking for a Polish label which is Mieszko, which sounds very, very similar. Another executive responded, this carries association with scouts from Soviet times. Another executive responds, a bit like Red Camp. And there is laughter. And in Poland, I didn't really understand at that time what Red Camp meant because I was too young to understand. But this is a reference to youth holiday camps that were popular in the Soviet era in Poland. And it has a mocking overtone in Poland. It has this connotations of the communist indoctrination of the USSR youth. And another said, a Soviet pioneer, right? So again, a word was seen as unsuitable because of those connotations, unsuitable in the Polish context. So they were edited out. There were other suggestions about, for example, including a reference to shareholders. That was clearly dismissed, but shareholder because, as Szymon says, but this is not very gripping. It's about commercialization, which sounds dreadful in Poland. Commercialization in the Polish reality means rotten capitalism. This is the same story as if we said that we're here to deliver results for the shareholders. This is an American philosophy, so we've got a clear distancing. And there's agreement that this is the real goal, but we can't really say this because it's not very gripping, and we need to think about increasing the chances of success of this managerial initiative, which was seen as a tool to affect staff behaviours and attitudes, and if it has associations with scouts, pioneers, or Russian context or indoctrination, it is not likely to be successful. So the third process that we've discovered, that is on the next slide. Thank you. Focuses on inscribing. So, which was very much focused on trying to imbue the text with guidelines for staff. There were even clear references made about the tips that the values would give to staff about how they were expected to behave. There was clear agreement among the new executive team about the need for feisty staff that would demonstrate drive. There was quite widespread criticism that staff were not willing to take initiative, that they were still living in the old reality of micromanagement and bureaucracy, that because of this, they've lost their motivation to work and come up with ideas. They were not willing to take risks. And those type of characteristics were seen as required in order to improve the financial performance of their organization. The exchanges, the microprocesses that we observed, focus very much on adding guidelines for staff in the translation process. So Alicia, for example, says, there are some people who are persistent, but we want the whole organization to understand that if somebody is persistent in doing something, they do not become boring and a pain. To understand that they are pursuing a goal. If I come to the finance director and ask him 10 times about something, he will tell me, okay, you are persistent, here you go. He won't tell me, leave me alone, I can't stand you. So this was, again, very much using the values in order to signal to staff what behaviours are valued. Thank you. Can we move on? So we tried to capture the micropolitical processes through a conceptual model, putting all together. So we said that we need to look at interlingual translation seriously because it can help us show how assets, so in this case, values travel from one context to another. And it is important to look at language. We can't look at only other practices. We need to focus on translation. So as I mentioned to you, the translation started with the source text, the corporate values. Then we noticed purpose in adding a particular outcome orientation to the process, which took place before the actual translation act. But the action, as we say, goes beyond the translation act itself. We then have these 3 different processes of reframing, inscribing, and domesticating, which produced the target text. So to summarize the contribution, which is on the next slide, thank you, we're saying that because we took language seriously, in particular, we zoomed in on interlingual translation, drawing on translation studies to look at translation as a process, as an interaction, as a political process. We're able to contribute to the study of power and politics in international business because we're able to advance the understanding of interactual and processual dynamics of micropolitics rather than seeing micropolitics as acts of individuals. So then we're shifting this attention and we're showing how power unfolds through the processes that we've discussed in the paper. We're also showing, thanks to this analysis of the 6-hour translation meeting, that interlingual translation is a political process and it can help us understand the complexity of policy implementation, corporate policy implementation in the subsidiaries, at the subsidiary level, which again sheds light on the headquarters subsidiary relationships. So these are quite big claims based on a very small translation, but we're showing again that you can make a contribution to important international business topics by zooming in and taking language seriously. Thank you, Doris, we're good to go ahead. So looking at another example, in this case, this was a conceptual paper. Well, it started as an empirical paper, but due to revision, multiple revisions in journals, we've decided to cut the empirics, and it ended up being a conceptual paper. Here we're trying to, in that paper, we're showing how the focus of linguistic, how the language lens and the inclusion focus on language can help us broaden the focus scope of diversity and inclusion studies. So the argument of the paper is broader, and I'll only focus on the linguistic element of this. If somebody's interested, I've put the reference to the whole paper. So a starting point, which is on the next slide, thank you, is that we know that the equality, diversity, inclusion agenda is notoriously difficult to implement. So we know that companies declare their commitment to the EDI, but equally there's evidence both in practitioner reports, CAPD reports, also recent McKinsey report, and reports in academic papers, that despite this commitment, it was difficult to implement. We also know that current diversity and inclusion debates tend to focus on a rather small set of dimensions, which rarely include language. We've had many different calls to include language diversity in diversity studies. And also, for example, there have been calls to which suggest that we need to accent needs to be a protected characteristic, for example. But still, there isn't enough work that focuses on language diversity. And so in our paper, we said, well, we need to take the calls to consider language as a core aspect of diversity more seriously, and we need to study it more systematically. So in our paper, we're using linguistic inclusion as an important illustration of our key theoretical points. And we're saying that what we're trying to do in the paper is trying to propose a model which is both conceptual and also practical in order to help us promote the EDI agenda. But first of all, we need to understand what is linguistic inclusion. We see it as both a process and an outcome. And as a process, we see linguistic inclusion as focusing on actions which are designed to promote positive perceptions, attitudes, and also actions towards linguistic diversity. And also as an outcome, that would be a situation or a state where there is a lack of language-based divisions or discrimination or privileges based on linguistic backgrounds. So this was our starting point. We've also observed other aspects, which are on the next slide. Thank you. That we also built our argument of the fact that linguistic inclusion matters. And why does it matter? We answered this question by drawing on insights from different strands of work, so from sociolinguistics, but also, surprisingly, there were a lot of really important studies in social psychology, also in applied linguistics, in particular focusing on language acquisition, studies on language attitudes, and there's also a considerable body of work in international business and cross-cultural communication. So we put in those insights together in order to make an argument that linguistic inclusion really matters, and we need to include the language lens in diversity and inclusion studies. So there was consistent evidence across the different disciplines that language-based discrimination exists, and that it is very prevalent, and also that it has very important consequences both for individuals, for groups, and therefore for organizations more broadly. And how do we define language-based discrimination? We see this as unfair treatment of an individual or a group based on the language, based on the features of the language. And I see that Doris has left the session, so I'm wondering whether she'll be able to change the slides in a minute. We'll see. So what we know from studies across those disciplines is that languages are very much socially unequal. So there's a pyramid of status and influence associated with languages, and actually a very small proportion of languages, a tiny proportion of languages, sort of 2% at the peak of the pyramid, of status and influence of language, whereas other languages are seen as more peripheral. And also within those languages seen as having, and that's usually often English as having this high status, then it's also only what is seen as the standard language norms, which are seen as having the highest prestige, rather than the different local regional varieties. So we know that language is heavily influenced by language ideologists, and those ideologists make it seem more natural. There's this hierarchical relationships among speakers from different backgrounds. And we also know that those ideologies, together with language proficiency or perceived language proficiency, they mediate inclusion in linguistic societies. So they have a very important role to play. And Doris is back, which is great. So we're looking at language-based discrimination, and we try to unpack how it works, drawing on, as I mentioned, those different disciplines. So we know that language is an important signifier of difference, and because it signifies this difference, it also constitutes a salient marker of people's identity, and this is a very crucial marker of people's identity. We also know, as research from different strands of work shows, is that vocal clues, they can be very small vocal clues that can be non-standard accented speech. And non-standard, what we mean by non-standard is both speech which focuses on ethnicity, which signals different ethnic backgrounds, which also shows regional variations, which also refers to a person, might signal person's social status. So working class background, for example, that this accented speech or foreign speech, so we have foreign accented speech. So we have those non-standard cues, accented cues, also non-standard grammar, perhaps speech in disfluency, and the use of different linguistic norms, so different, it could be different intonation, differences in turn taking, differences in encoded in language about disagreements, etc. All those vocal clues, they signal minority group membership, and with this comes the speaker's status, right? So we've got very simple clues that can signal and signify the speaker's status. And research shows that even very proficient foreign language users can be subject to language-based discrimination based on those very subtle clues, because they have, for example, different conversational styles or slightly different pronunciations, foreign accented pronunciation, even if they are very proficient. Research demonstrates that there is a hierarchy of privilege associated with language proficiency and also the standard speech. And there's a big problem about with in particular non-accented, non-standard accented speech, which can activate a range of stereotypes, class, ethnic, cultural stereotypes, which then lead to evaluations. But interestingly, those lead to evaluations which are not only linguistic, and importantly, those are evaluations about non-linguistic competence, such as people's intelligence, trustworthiness, attitudes to work, etc. So as you can see, this is a very important part, and language can be a very important source of discriminatory behaviours and judgments that can have a very important consequences for people's possibility to get promoted, to obtain a job. But also, research has shown that it matters for decision-making thoughts, or it matters when at school, when children with regional accents, non-standard accents or foreign accents might be evaluated less positively. So we're saying that it actually is very important to broaden, to look at language seriously when you talk about diversity and inclusion. If you look at the next slide. Thank you. These are just a few illustrations one close to home. There was an article not that long ago in The Guardian focusing and exposing problems and classism and racism and accent prejudice in UK universities, top UK universities. Interestingly, these were universities up north in the country where a lot of students actually spoke with regional accents, but still students from who lived in close proximity to the university experienced accent prejudice. The same applied to students with working class backgrounds, etc. And the other paper refers to a British Academy mid-career fellowship focusing on and exposing again the large scale, the existence and the scale of the prejudices towards regional accents in the UK. If we can move ahead. Thank you. So our purpose in that particular paper was both conceptual and practical. We wanted to expand diversity inclusion studies by focusing on linguistic inclusion, but also practical just to help achieve a shift in perspective towards organisational inclusion. So we suggested that the starting point was a situation in which language differences are seen as a deficiency on the part of foreign language or non-standard language users. And when we have a clear distinction, a binary distinction between native and non-native speakers, and we see this distinction as being very static, and also we allocate a lot of importance to whom we see as native speakers, and the focus is on generic language proficiency, irrespective of context and language use. And that results in native speakers being used as the benchmark of competence, regardless of the fact that native speakers have a very different variety of competences naturally, and regardless of the negative consequences of this. And there's this assumed superiority of standard language used, even though research shows that in certain situations, it is the first language users who can create problems and misunderstanding, because, for example, they use high context language, or they used difficult phrases to understand, or they might themselves have difficulties in understanding others because they're not accustomed to different accents. And that results in high disparity. So the non-dominant groups, so for example, foreign and non-standard language users, then are expected to adjust, and they are expected to make an effort, and they are expected to emulate the dominant norm. So we're suggesting that we need to look at, in order to achieve inclusion, linguistic inclusion as an outcome, in which we have positive perceptions towards linguistic variety, in which we don't have that many language-based divisions and separations, and where language discrimination is not that prevalent. We need to focus on inclusion as a process, and we're suggesting that we need 2 steps for this. One is we need to think differently, and also we need to act differently. So to start with, we need to see language differences as a resource, and we need to challenge those binary distinctions between native and non-native speakers. And this debate has been ongoing in linguistic studies. I understand we've got linguistic colleagues here, so they will be familiar with this distinction. We need to consider language proficiency in context, depending on the need and the interaction. We need to think about plurilingual competence. So this is the ability to draw on different linguistic resources and recognize that people will have different language profiles, and they can draw on them differently in different contexts. And then we need to also focus on members of the dominant and non-dominant groups, and mutual accommodation, and then focusing, for example, on language training and our efforts of both first language users and also others who speak with a foreign language. So I know that I've whizzed through this, so I'm talking very quickly, but I realise that I'm running out of time. So I think it would be helpful for us to look at the concluding comments, which is probably 10 slides ahead, Doris. That might be difficult to locate this slide, but it has a title of concluding comments. Okay, if this is tricky to find, I can just Okay, there we are. Thank you. Concluding observation. So I've skipped another example as I expected. We don't have enough time to discuss this. But I use this example to showcase that there is potential for language sensitive studies which take language seriously to contribute to different fields within business and management. And I used some examples of my research. This is not to suggest that these are the best examples. There's so much fantastic research out there which really makes an amazing contribution to those fields. I've referred to some of those studies if you want to read them further. But what I'm suggesting is that taking language really seriously helps us challenge some of the implicit assumptions. For example, the distinction between native and non-native speakers, or the assumption that there is a language barrier out there and it is the problem of the foreign language users. We can also expand the focus of our studies. One of my planned projects focuses on socialization, but looking at the implications of different accents, regional accents and foreign accents on the experiences of transitioning into organizational towards organizational inclusion. So we can expand well-known studies. We can also ask new questions. We can shift existing debates. We can integrate concepts from different disciplines or draw from different concepts, as I've illustrated, for example, with interlingual translation. Naturally, it is not easy because we know when we try to, so there are great opportunities, but when you try to publish, it is tricky. It is tricky to cross disciplines. I've tried to publish, now I've got a paper under review in a translation studies journal, and the writing style is very different. Even as we know, even crossing the difference, the boundary between organizational studies and international business, those are different writing conventions. So it is difficult because of the conventions of the discipline, but also sometimes we have the same concepts, but we understand it very differently. But that can also have its benefits. We can be more reflexive and we can enrich our discussions through talking to others. And I wanted to recommend a paper by Helena Tenzer and colleagues that provides an overview and suggests very nice avenues for future research. And on the next slide, and if you're interested, I've posted an event that is taking place in April by Rebecca Pickeri. She's the founding member, as I mentioned before, of this language sensitive strand of research. And the event is free of charge, and she'll provide undoubtedly a much more in-depth overview of the field because she has authored also many review papers. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you, Doris, for sharing the slides and for helping out. And it will be interesting to see how we can discuss when I can't really hear you guys. But we can maybe see some comments in the chat. Thank you, Janelle. I think we can even maybe stop sharing, Doris, so that I can participants can see each other, unless you want to have a look at the slides later. Thank you, John. I'm also aware of the fact that we are running out of time. I'm also happy if there are some more detailed questions. I'm happy to take them via email later on, or we could arrange a quick catch up just to have a chat. If, for example, if the presentation has generated some thoughts and you would like to talk about your research, I'm very happy to chat. It would be great to chat, actually. Top here, questions. Top here. I'm not able to hear questions, but I can read the questions in the chat. And okay, so we've got a question from Ronke. Oh, it has disappeared. Let me see. Okay, I'm trying to find the question. It has disappeared from the chat. I think the question was, are there any other challenges, if I understand? Can you type it again so that I can change it? Thank you. Picture of linguistics having, okay, now I can see the chat. Okay. Linguistics having changed to a more dynamic view, yet in our case study, the importance was on words. Wouldn't users be able to figure out the meaning in context, even if the translation is not ideal? That's a very good question. Thank you, Klaus. We focused in the translation event. We wanted to focus not so much on words, but we wanted to focus on the meanings behind between the words and how participants co-created the meaning. So it wasn't our intention to see language as very much static. And wouldn't participants be able to figure out the meaning in context? Yes, they would. Translation is certainly not ideal. What we tried to show in the paper was that was the focus on sense giving. So not so much on, it was both sense giving, so how participants made sense of the translation, but also how the managers try to imbue the words, the values with particular meaning through additions, through omissions, through a strategic selection of labels. In relation to none. Okay. All right, there's also a question from Ronke. Are there any further challenges in relation to non-English languages? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but there are different challenges. So there are challenges of doing research across languages. There are challenges with representation. There are challenges with language hierarchy. I'm not sure what non-EU. Well, there are also challenges naturally in academic writing. The academia is enslaved to English, so we're not considering other languages. Representation, yes. So there are issues of representation, and in fact, Doris and I and with colleagues on one of the project that we're working on are trying to raise awareness about this the need for linguistic reflexivity and to focus on to make more conscious choices about the representation when we look at the languages. So to make to make translation more visible. Okay, there's a comment from Danielle about the English. How much do we value their mother tongue? How are you? Not. I always insist in integrating all our languages, regardless of where they come from. This is how I learned African languages. Indeed, yes. So I agree with you. And one of my actually master's students, not master's, undergraduate students, has recently carried out a project about students' perception of language asymmetries, and some of the quotes were indeed shocking. How decisions about assignment work are made in teams, that students are not given a voice because of the link that is being made between the language competence and the subject competence. Okay, we've got another questions from Wupan. I was about to ask about the challenges in academia and what we expect from our students and indoctrination. These are some great questions, guys. Thank you very much for your engagement in the presentation. Well, it was about, well, there were two questions in here. So one is about the challenges academia. Well, there are so many challenges academia, as we know. There are challenges for academics coming from different linguistics contexts. There are challenges when we look at, when we talk about teaching. There are challenges also when we collaborate with others in a multilingual team. because of all the extra work that is required when we do research across different languages. So, who does the translation? At which stage do we do the translation? What happens when we translate? How do we translate? What happens with the original? How do we represent this? So there's a huge range of challenges in translation, and what we expect from students and indoctrination, indeed, about the representation that we want. Yes, there's a massive question. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, and I know that we haven't booked that much time, so I wonder whether there's a question that I haven't overlooked. That I have overlooked. If I have, would you mind typing it again? I'll just check, and I think we've covered them all. I know that I haven't provided a brief answer to all of them. Okay, I don't think I'm seeing any questions. I know that colleagues have to leave. Let me know if you want me to leave as well. There are other questions. Thank you very much for your patience and for being with me despite this very unusual way of talking about language where we can't really hear you. I'm not sure whether this. Somebody has just called me. I wasn't sure whether it was Nigel or one of you guys. I haven't responded just in case, but if it's you, let me call again and I'll pick up. Thank you very much for your very positive comments. Okay, Nigel is calling. Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, Klaus. Okay. Hello.